I have always found it quaint and rather touching that there is a movement, Libertarians, in the US that thinks Americans are not yet selfish enough. Christopher Hitchens.
So an ideology that believes that people should be left alone who aren't hurting anybody somehow also believes that people aren't selfish enough. Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
I'm fairly certain that a fair proportion of you, my subscribers, consider yourself libertarian.
Well, I'm not one of your subscribers, but I do consider myself to be libertarian.
And so with this in mind, I invite you to reply to what I have to say on this topic below in the comments.
I'll do you one better. I'll make a response video.
If you think my following reasons are insufficient, please let me know, as I appreciate that I might just be missing something, and if I am, I want to know it.
Well, in that case, good sir, hopefully this video here will be of use to you.
Anyhow, to explain why I'm not a libertarian, it stands to reason that I begin by describing what exactly libertarianism is.
The idea that it's wrong to hurt people? I'm not even shooting you, it's literally that simple. That's all the explanation that you really need.
Right? And so, here's an attempt to stillman it. Likewise to all political philosophies, libertarianism represents a wide array of movements and beliefs, but all are predicated on the core principle of liberty.
Now this much he does get right. Libertarianism does cover a vast array of political ideologies, both on the left and the right. There's anarchists, minarchists, libertarian capitalists, libertarian socialists, the list goes on and on. But all these different flavors of libertarianism all share the same common root, that is the belief in the non-aggression principle, which is what I'm assuming he means when he says liberty.
Now what exactly liberty means depends on the libertarian.
Well, all liberty means is the ability to live your life as you please so long as you're not hurting anybody. Now the optimal way to utilize that liberty may vary between individuals, but the actual definition of the concept of liberty is by and large not up to debate.
As traditional libertarians sought to abolish capitalism and private property, while contemporary libertarians advocate laissez-faire capitalism and strong private property rights.
Actually, there's libertarians who believe both. What we believe is that people should be free to live as they please so long as they're not hurting anybody. So there's nothing saying that people who prefer capitalism can't go own their own property and exchange everything using money, and people who prefer a more collectivist or social way of living wouldn't be able to go and pursue that and start their own commune or co-op or whatever. People on both sides would be free to live under their preferred system so long as they're not imposing it onto anyone who would prefer the other system.
But a fair summation of all libertarians is that they seek maximum freedom of the individual and minimum authority of government.
More accurately, we believe that it's equally wrong for everybody to violate people's rights, and that it doesn't really make any sense to say that a certain group of people have some magic ability to just violate people's rights that none of the rest have because you call them something different. So yeah, libertarians are equally against any sort of rights violation from any organization, whatever you call it. We just happen to be particularly critical of government because they, for one reason or another, have the perceived legitimacy to violate people's rights that nobody else has.
As such, they tend to insist upon freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to bear arms, freedom of and from religion, freedom of the press, freedom of ownership, freedom of the economy, and they almost always oppose the welfare state and taxation.
Well, that's because those last two you listed entail initiating force against innocent people,
which they see as a form of slavery.
Well, think about it for a minute. When is it that you owe the government money? Is it when you use a government service? Is it when you sign a contract and agree to it? No, it's as soon as you earn money. As soon as you earn income, the government claims a right to that income that you've earned, regardless whether or not you use any government services, regardless of whether or not you agree to it. And there's no way for you to opt out. There's no way for you to revoke your consent. This has the implication that the state is somehow entitled to results of labor that you performed. It's a claim to your labor. And if someone else owns your labor, that's by definition slavery.
Or as the American Libertarian Party puts it, we hold that all individuals have the right to exercise sole dominion over their own lives and have the right to live in whatever manner they choose, so long as they do not forcibly interfere with the equal rights of others to live in whatever manner they choose. Now that sounds pretty damn reasonable, right? Penn Jillette and Michael Shermer seem to think so.
But I voted Libertarian for many years now.
I've leaned Libertarian most of my life since college.
As does Ron Paul.
They said the role of government ought to be but one thing: protect liberty. That's the purpose of government.
Although there are plenty of anarchists who would argue that government is fundamentally incapable of doing this, but that's a conversation for a different video.
Clint Eastwood.
And now you have called yourself a libertarian, is that right? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, libertarian values, that's where Republicans used to be when they were saving money and everything.
And according to libertarian websites, Keanu Reeves,
Well, what is the Matrix other than one big metaphor for the state?
Chris Rock, Vince Vaughn, Will Wheaton, Matt Groening, and countless more.
Yeah, I believe Matt Groening is libertarian. There are plenty of Simpsons episodes that make fun of the federal government.
And so why doesn't it convince me? Well, what follows is my three primary reasons. This is why I'm not a libertarian.
And what follows are my reasons why you should reconsider.
One of the most eloquent and convincing summations of the libertarian philosophy that I've ever heard of comes from Walter Edward Williams, who in his book titled All It Takes Is Guts wrote the following. But let me offer you my definition of social justice. I keep what I earn and you keep what you earn. Do you disagree? Well then, tell me how much of what I earn belongs to you and why.
Now pay close attention to this question. There's two parts to it. How much and why. Keep this in the back of your head because it comes back to bite you in the ass later.
And so, what's my answer? Why do I think that strangers are entitled to some of Walter's fruit?
Well, if you're like any other lefty out there, I'd say it's because he has more stuff than you do. And again, like every other lefty out there, the logic suddenly flips when considering people who have less than you do.
Well, to put it bluntly, Walter fell out of the right vagina at the right time.
Vagina. Vagina. I wanna have sex with your vagina.
He inherited a biological and/or socio-economic advantage that he did not earn.
What sort of biological and socioeconomic advantages did he inherit though? And how did these advantages contribute to his success? Who's to say he wouldn't have still been successful without these advantages? This is something that people do on the left quite frequently. They throw around a lot of vague terminology and invoke these vague concepts without explaining anything in detail because they mostly want to try and twist logic to try and tug at your sympathy.
And thus he does not deserve all of the fruit of his labour.
So do you remember how a moment ago I mentioned that the left likes to manipulate logic to tug at your sympathy? Well, as it turns out, it's politically convenient for them if you view the wealthy antagonistically. And one of their primary tools to this end is painting this whole narrative that the wealthy don't actually earn the money that they have. They just lucked out, or somehow stumbled upon it. The truth is though that most people who are rich did actually work hard to earn the money they have. Yes, it's true, some people luck out, they inherit from a family member who passed away, or they happen to purchase the right lottery ticket. Some people who are wealthy because of luck, but that is the minority. That's the exception. The rule is hard work is what makes people wealthy. And this can be easily evidenced by the fact that those who become wealthy through hard work are more likely to remain wealthy than those who earn it by luck. So when people become wealthy through hard work, they're much more likely to spend that money carefully to invest it than someone who just wins the lottery or inherits it. Someone who spent their whole life working to earn $1 million is much more likely to, use to buy stock and perhaps grow a business compared to someone who wins $1 million in a contest. First thing they'll probably do is blow it on a yacht or a jet or something like that.
He was dealt good cards.
Even if it were true that most of the wealthy gain their wealth through luck rather than hard work, that still doesn't mean they're not entitled to it. You'd still have to come up with some sort of a justification if you wanted to take it from them. Imagine you walk into a store and buy a lottery ticket. You scratch it off to reveal the winning numbers. When you go to cash in your lottery ticket, the clerk says, "Oh, sorry, well, we're not giving you anything because you didn't earn that money, you lucked out on it." Imagine yourself sitting at home on a couch, watching your favorite game show. You have Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, Deal or No Deal. Imagine one of the contestants wins, and the host says, "Congratulations, but unfortunately you're not getting your prize, because you see, you gained it through luck, you didn't earn it. So on behalf of the Burn Man, we've decided we're going to democratically and socially, contractually redistribute your prize for my greater good."
Now, Walter came from a broken family in a relatively racist country, and so how the hell can I say that he had an advantage?
Actually, yeah, that's something I'm rather curious of myself. Anyone familiar with the context of Mr. Walter's childhood will understand why it's a bit of a heavy lift to argue that he was born with some sort of advantage.
Well, for him, it's got more to do with nature than nurture.
If this is true, that people are supposedly mostly products of their circumstances rather than their own doing, why is it that people born in identical circumstances can end up living radically different lives? Since we're using Mr. Williams here as an example, consider the circumstances he grew up in. He was born to a poor family in a not so good part of Philadelphia during a time in history where blacks weren't treated the best, and even though all these factors were working against him, he still ended up living a a wealthy and successful life, one that most people in those same circumstances never had the opportunity to. So Mr. Rationality, Rules, or whatever, can you please explain to me how it is that we are ultimately products of our circumstances and how people can live completely different lives given similar circumstances? That just doesn't make sense to me.
And to explain why, let me rewind a bit. In 1971, the American political philosopher John Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice, and within it, he, as many of you likely know, observed that when people contemplate and determine the structure and rules of society, they do so selfishly.
Well, we libertarians think that there should be a consistent set of rules that applies equally across the board. It's people on the left who usually contemplate the rules of society in a selfish way. When contemplating people who are richer than them, they're all gung-ho about wealth redistribution and welfare. But funny enough, usually that attitude takes a 180-degree turn when it comes time to consider people who have less than they do,
based on their personal circumstances, characteristics, and preferences, such as their mental and physical abilities, social status, ethnicity, gender, and, most crucially, their conception of what's good.
That seems to describe welfare statism down to a T.
Thus, it's no surprise that some people who can afford the bare basics, such as shelter and food, want a society in which they're not obliged, through tax, to pay towards other people's bare basics.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife.
Likewise, it's no surprise that some people who can afford to pay for their family's medical bills want a society in which they're not obliged, through tax, to pay towards strangers' medical bills. Just as it's no surprise that some people who can afford to send their children to school want a society in which they're not obliged, through tax, to pay for other people's children to go to school, and so on and so forth. But the only reason they seek such a society, Rawls argued, is because of their lucky circumstances.
Actually, it's because we're against violence and coercion. Many libertarians do in fact sympathize with the plight of those who can't afford to obtain their basic necessities. What we'd like to do is come up with a way to help these people that doesn't involve violence or coercion, which is why we suggest things like charity or mutual aid societies over the welfare state. Just because we're against a specific solution to a problem doesn't mean we're apathetic about the problem. There is more than one potential solution to any given issue. In fact, Mr. Rationality here seems to understand this basic point. Notice how in each of the examples he gives, after mentioning the example, he emphasizes through tax. The fact that he makes a point to emphasize through tax after each example heavily implies that he understands that there is more than one potential way to ensure these provisions for the less well-off.
They've been dealt good biological and socio-economic cards, and as such, they stand to lose a card or two should society attempt to equalize the hands of those less fortunate.
Actually, everyone stands to lose a card or two because societies that put equality over personal rights tend to not go down so well. How productive do you think people would be knowing that any wealth that they produce is subject to redistribution at any time? Do you really think the plight of the less fortunate is helped at all by economic systems that historically turn things like bread and toilet paper into precious commodities?
Now, to get around this prejudice, Rawls proposed what he called the original position, and argued that a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'd be willing to enter it in a random place.
Right, so society where the rules are non-arbitrary and apply equally to everybody across the board. Hi, welcome to Libertarianism.
He reasoned that if people determined the basic structure of society behind a veil of ignorance, which would deprive them of information about their specific characteristics such as their ethnicity, social status, and gender, they would create a welfare state. They'd elect a society that maximizes the prospects of the worst off, because they themselves might be the worst off.
Perhaps it is true that behind this so-called veil of ignorance, people would prefer a society in which the worst off are the best off, because for all they know, they may very well end up being one of the worst off. While I don't necessarily disagree with Rawls on this, I don't believe it entails a welfare state. It turns out that the types of places where the worst off are the best off, to use Rawlsian terminology, are places that are more economically free. Per capita charity and humanitarian spending is higher in places that are more economically free, and environments that are more business friendly, that is, less taxes and regulations, there's more opportunities for people to seek out employment or starting their own business. So as I've mentioned time and time again, when you have a free economy, not only is there more support for the poor, but there is also less poor to support. So if we were to apply Rawls' veil of ignorance to the economic data and historical precedent, we see that poor people living in free countries are living lives equal or greater than the wealthy in a lot of authoritarian countries, it seems clear to me that the type of society that benefits the worst off is a free society. So as it turns out, in an attempt to make an argument for the welfare state, Rawls ended up inadvertently creating an argument for capitalism.
And isn't it ironic? Don't you think? A little too ironic.
They'd create a society that would ensure that if they or their loved ones were born blind, deaf, or dumb, they'd nevertheless have a life worth living.
The way for these people to have a life worth living is for them to challenge themselves to reach their full potential, to find ways to make the best of their less than ideal circumstances, not to become dependent on the state. The clip that you just showed with the kid with no arms who learned to write with his feet, if anything, that exemplifies just how perfectly capable people are of adapting to circumstances that may not be ideal.
Thus, this is the primary reason I'm not a libertarian. Despite the fact that I came from a broken family and had a very rough upbringing, I am extremely lucky to have the characteristics that I do.
I'm very sorry to hear about your rough upbringing, but do you think the fact that you're able to succeed and have all these positive characteristics in spite of your upbringing may have to do with effort and hard work on your part? Consider other people who may have had a similar upbringing to yours. If we were to compare your life to theirs, do you think the outcome would be comparable? If people can be born in similar circumstances but ended up living different lives, what else, other than personal choice, can account for that?
While I've worked extremely hard to get where I am, I did not earn the temperament, patience, charisma, and, if you will, intellect that I have. I was simply dealt good biological cards.
But those aren't biological traits, those are character traits. The difference is that character traits are something you can take the initiative to change about yourself. Biological traits are more or less the way they are. You can take the initiative to become smarter, more creative, more talented, more patient, more charismatic. Now you can argue that one's physical biology does impact how these certain character or mental aspects of you are developed, and I can't say I disagree necessarily, but that doesn't mean it's out of your control completely.
Thus, I'm convinced that some of the fruit of my labour should go to those less fortunate.
Then give to charity. You've, through some sort of strange mental gymnastics, convinced yourself that you don't actually deserve what you earn, which, alright, whatever. But if you think that your wealth should be redistributed, you don't need the state to come and take it. You can, of your own volition, hand it out to charities. I won't stop you.
And that the same is true of Walter's fruit.
Well, that's fantastic, but since it's his money, he does get the final decision in that regard.
Now, Sam Harris, in a post titled How to Lose Readers Without Even Trying, which admittedly makes me a little nervous about my releasing this video, put Rawls' original position this way. Many of my critics pretend they have been entirely self-made. They seem to feel responsible for their intellectual gifts, for their freedom from injury and disease, and for the fact that they were born at a specific moment in history.
So yeah, nobody actually argues that they're completely responsible for their success, or that luck hasn't contributed at all. Even if luck does somewhat contribute to a person's success, that still doesn't mean they don't work hard to earn it, or that they wouldn't have been successful were it not for the luck. If I were born in less ideal circumstances, would I be as successful as I am now? Maybe, maybe not. The only thing I'm certain of is that I'm ultimately responsible for my actions, and if I want to improve my life, that's on me.
Many appear to have absolutely no awareness of how lucky one must be to succeed at anything in life, no matter how hard one works.
Hard work and determination is what leads to most success in life. Now, luck can help out. I don't think there's a single person who would contest that. But there's a reason people go to college instead of the casino to improve their future.
One must be lucky to be able to work.
Well, thanks to VPNs and similar technology, you don't even have to get out of bed to work.
One must be lucky to be intelligent, to not have cerebral palsy.
You know, back in college, I had a friend who had cerebral palsy. She went to class, held down a job, basically lived a normal life. That's not to say it was all peachy for her, certain things were more difficult, but instead of whining and bitching for sympathy, she worked hard to make the most of her circumstances.
Or to not have been bankrupt in middle age by the mortal illness of a spouse.
Why would having to care for someone with mortal illness drive somebody bankrupt? Could it have something to do with lefties constantly wanting to fuck up the medical insurance system?
Many of us have been extraordinarily lucky, and we did not earn it. Many good people have been extraordinarily unlucky, and they did not deserve it.
It's true that a lot of people don't have the best luck in the world, but it's also true that a lot of those people, rather than bitching about how lucky other people are, do something to try and improve their circumstances. So roughly a month ago, I got fired from a job and totaled my car in an accident within a 2-week span. So yeah, I know how it feels to have shit luck, but I also know what it takes to try and improve your circumstances when you have shit luck.
And yet, I get the distinct sense that if I asked some of my readers why they were not born with club feet or orphaned before the age of 5, they would not hesitate to take credit for these accomplishments.
But what if you talk to someone who had clubbed feet or was orphaned at the age of 5 but ended up living a successful life nonetheless? They'd probably explain to you why half this video is bullshit.
Anyhow, moving on, the second reason I'm not a libertarian is because I don't believe in natural rights.
So where do you think rights come from then, if not from nature? I mean, you do believe in rights after all. That's the basis you use to advocate for wealth redistribution. Yeah, earlier in a video he was building all these arguments about how the less well-off are morally entitled to the fruits of the more successful, and how the more successful have an inherent obligation toward those less well-off. And now he's going to deny natural rights. This guy's playing a serious game of Jenga.
Which I would argue is the very bedrock of libertarianism. If it wasn't, then all of morality would come down to arbitrary private contracts, and libertarians certainly don't believe that this is the case.
I do agree with him on this particular point, but just to clarify, contracts have the authority that they do because there's something non-arbitrary to back them up, that being your free moral agency to do with as you please with your life, liberty, and property. And if someone else is not fulfilling their side of an agreement, or worse, presenting the agreement on fraudulent terms, they're circumventing your agency, your mental agency that you have over your life, liberty, and property, thus violating your natural rights. And this is why I think a purely contract-based theory of ethics, such as that put forth by Thomas Hobbes, is confused. Contracts are backed by morality, not the other way around. Otherwise, there'd be no basis to hold someone responsible for violating a contract.
They hold that we are born with certain inalienable rights, namely life, liberty, and, in most cases, property. But I see absolutely no justification for this.
Do you think someone should be able to kill you? If not, you believe in a right to life. Do you think someone should be able to cage you or enslave you or boss you around, tell you what to do arbitrarily? You believe in right to liberty. Do you think someone should be able to just bust into your house and start taking your shit? Well, you do advocate for wealth redistribution, but you do acknowledge the claim to at least some of what you have. So, to an extent, you do believe in a right to property.
Many libertarians, such as John Locke, insist that these rights are God-given, that we have the right to liberty because God said so. But I, as an atheist, obviously don't find this convincing. And what's more, even if I was a Christian like Locke, I'd still reject his assertion, as in my opinion, the Bible explicitly states that it's perfectly fine to deprive certain people of liberty. While other believers in natural rights, though not strictly libertarian, such as Immanuel Kant, insist that natural rights are derived from reason alone.
And that's what a majority of modern libertarians believe. Morality is similar to mathematics and logic in that it's objectively provable, although not empirically observable.
That, in Kant's case, they're categorical imperatives. But I reject this because I don't believe any action is non-contingent, and I'll likely explain exactly why in a future video, rather than needlessly cluttering this one.
The categorical imperative isn't non-contingent, it's self-contingent. Here's the difference. An act is non-contingent if it's done completely at random to no end for no reason whatsoever, which I agree is logically impossible. The categorical imperative, however, is self-contingent. It's a means to its own end. And Kant had a very clever way of building this argument. The crux of it is very simple: consistency. For an argument to be valid, it cannot be contradictory. It has to remain consistent. Well, if somebody is doing something, but at the same time doesn't want other people doing that same something, well, obviously that's an inconsistency. If somebody has no qualm stealing from other people, but at the same time expects their own property rights to be respected, they would have to somehow account for this contradiction, that they have property rights, but these other people don't. So by simply pointing out a fact about reality, that arguments have to be consistent nor be valid, Kant has essentially stuck the spotlight on anybody who wants to claim special rights or privileges nobody else has. So by pointing out the logical expectation that people must respect other people's rights in order to claim their own, Kant essentially created something that's self-contingent. In order to have rights, I must respect rights.
And so to those of you who are libertarian and non-religious, I'd like to ask a question. What makes you think we're born with natural rights?
Because you inherently by nature own yourself. Ownership is the exclusive ability to exert one's full will over something. Because you do that to yourself by default, you own yourself by default. If someone else were to try to claim ownership over you, well, they'd have a tough time because first of all, you are there first by definition. They'd also have to deprive you of your current ownership, which again, you can't really do since you own yourself by default.
What part of the state of nature possibly yields the right to liberty? Sure, we're born free, but that doesn't mean we have the right to be free, does it?
Well, I can disprove that using a simple reductio ad absurdum. Let's start with premise 1. This is the one we seem to agree on. Everybody is born with freedom. So from that we get premise 2. Premise 2 is, because people are born with freedom, the only way for them to lose it is to have it taken from them. So if someone doesn't have freedom, it means it was taken from them. Premise 3, in order to deprive someone of their freedom, I have to have the freedom to take their freedom. Premise 4, in order to have the freedom to take someone else's freedom, my freedom has to be superior to theirs. If my freedom was equal to theirs, they could simply counteract any measure I take to try and take their freedom from them. So it must be the case that in order to take someone else's freedom, my freedom would have to somehow be better than their freedom. Now, premise 1 doesn't specify that anyone was born with more freedom or better freedom or special freedom, it just said everyone's born with freedom. So if I'm going to claim that my freedom is better or superior in some way, that's an active claim. I'm trying to make a claim to something not already established. In order to do that, the burden of proof is on me. So from the simple logical fact that the burden of justification is on the person wanting to take someone's freedom, the only conclusion you can draw from that is that people inherently have the right to be free.
As it stands, I maintain that Thomas Hobbes got it right when he said that in the absence of a social contract, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Well, in order to have contracts, you kind of have to have natural rights. Otherwise, there's nothing really obligating you to follow through with your contracts. Suppose someone breaks a contract. In order to hold them responsible for that, we'd have to somehow prove that they were obligated to follow through with the contract. Perhaps they signed another contract that says, I hereby agree to follow through with all contracts. But we'd run into the same problem. What now obligates them to follow through with that contract? And if you see where the problem is now, we have essentially an infinite regress of contracts. You see, in order for contracts to work, there has to be something that's inherently binding. So in order for the concept of contracts to exist, there has to be some sort of natural law or natural rights.
And yes, I know that Hobbes believed in natural rights, but I find his argument to be inadequate, albeit practical. Again, I'll try and address this in a future video. The third reason I'm not a libertarian is because I don't believe in libertarian free will.
So before I continue, something important I should probably explain. The word libertarianism is actually an umbrella term for any sort of idea or concept relating to individual free choice. That being said, most people associate the term with political libertarianism, but the term libertarian actually has its origin in what's known as the free will problem. It's a bit of a complex issue and beyond the scope of this video, but to provide a rough summarization, since your brain is an organ just like the heart, lungs, kidneys, etc., and each of those organs functions according to biological and physical principles that you don't really have any control over, what makes the brain different from these other organs? Basically, what makes it so that you're actually in control of your brain in spite of it being subject to the limitations of the physical world? Again, it is a rather complex subject, way more than a simple summary can do justice, but I encourage each of you watching this video to go and do additional research on the matter.
On top of the fact that we're not responsible for the biological and socio-economic characteristics that we possess, I also don't think we're responsible, in the libertarian sense, for anything. I've discussed the illusion of free will in previous videos and so won't repeat myself here, but in case you still believe in free will, and especially if it plays a role in your libertarian worldview, which I'd assume it must, please consider checking out said videos.
I honestly don't really have an opinion on this point, since I don't really have a background in psychology or neuroscience, or at least not nearly enough of one to be able to form an adequate opinion on the matter. But I will say this, the brain is made up of billions of neurons, and each of those neurons can form any number of synaptical connections with other neurons. If we were all just essentially meat robots, what's the need for such complexity?
If we're not responsible for our actions in the libertarian sense, which is to say, for example, if my being a YouTuber isn't entirely off my own volition, then how can I sincerely take credit for the fruit that it produces, let alone insist that I deserve them?
Well, you'd still own yourself, and by extension own your time and labor. You'd still be entitled to the results of your actions, even if those actions aren't ultimately the result of your own free will.
To use Rawlsian terminology, I might be entitled to most of the fruit, but I don't deserve them, and I certainly don't deserve all of them.
So in order for this point to hold any logical weight, you would need to explain what the difference is between being entitled to something and deserving something. Because the two terms are often used synonymously, but perhaps there's a nuance to it that you think we're missing.
If we're deterministic entities, libertarianism simply doesn't work.
Actually, it would still work. The non-aggression principle assumes that people behave as if they are free, not that they actually are free. So actual free will isn't really necessary. It's only necessary that people behave such as in a way that they have free will. Also, if you're a determinist, what makes you think that making this video to try and convince people to change their behavior and views is going to be of any use? Yet again, since you're a determinist, you probably believe that you're ultimately going to make the video no matter what, so I guess this is a moot point.
And so there you have it, the three primary reasons as to why I'm not a libertarian. Now don't get me wrong, I consider myself a liberal, at least in the classical sense, and in many situations I stand side by side with libertarians. But I don't call myself a libertarian because I don't believe in free will.
Well again, actual free will isn't needed for libertarianism to work. Just the belief that one is free, and the propensity to act in accordance with such a belief.
I don't believe in natural rights.
Which means that your basis to justify redistributing my wealth is just as valid as my basis to justify keeping it.
And, most crucially, and ironically, I don't believe libertarianism represents true liberty. True liberty, in my opinion, requires equal opportunity, and libertarianism doesn't deliver this.
We do believe in equality of opportunity. That's not what you want though. You want equality of outcome, and the two are mutually exclusive. In order to have one, you have to curtail the other. In order to have equality of opportunity, people have to be entitled to the results of their hard work. Therefore, you can't have equal outcomes. In order to have equal outcomes, you have to cripple people who work harder or are more successful, or at least punish them for it. So you can't have equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Pick one.
In fact, to the contrary, it protects those arbitrarily dealt good cards and leaves those arbitrarily dealt bad cards to die.
And you clearly believe that we need the state to step in and correct this. But let me ask you this. You seem rather trusting of the government to come in and help those who have been dealt bad cards at the expense of those who have been dealt good cards. But how many of those good and bad cards do you think were dealt by the state in the first place? From regulations that protect big companies at the expense of small businesses, to things like minimum wage and mandatory unions that make it a pain in the ass for companies to hire people, or licensing laws and other kinds of red tape that keep people from seeking out a living on their own. If you look at the data, it really seems like a lot of these people who've been dealt bad cards have been dealt those bad cards by the very state you believe should protect them.
It addresses freedom from, but it utterly fails to address freedom to.
Well, that's simply because positive rights don't exist. They can't be because logic breaks down when you consider what exactly a right is. If you have a right to something, that means that you have it, no questions asked. If someone tries interfering with that something, you can do whatever it takes to stop them, killing them if that's what it takes, to secure whatever it is you have a right to. Now, when you have a right to your own stuff, your own life, your own time, your own liberty, your own property, that's pretty straightforward and intuitive. As soon as you start claiming a right to other people's stuff, other people's time and labor, that's when things start to get dicey. Because if you claim a right to, say, housing or healthcare or education, you're also claiming a right to the labor needed to produce these things. You're saying, no questions asked, under any circumstances, that labor is mine. This logically entails slavery, and since most sane, rational people are against slavery, you would see why this would pose a problem.
Now, as said at the beginning, if you think any of my reasons are insufficient or that I'm missing something crucial, then please let me know, as I'm entirely self-taught, and as such, I appreciate that this makes me vulnerable to missing a thing or two, despite extensive research.
Well, in that case, good sir, I hope this video here will be of some use to you. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.